Hi, I decided to do my presentation on Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was born on August 1st, 1920 to Eliza and John Randall Lacks in Roanoke, Virginia. She was their 9th child. A few years later, Eliza died giving birth to their 10th child, and John decided that he could not take care of the 10 kids, so sent them off to live with various family members. Henrietta was sent to live with her grandfather on the family tobacco plantation in Clover, Virginia. Her first cousin, David Lacks, also lived with her grandfather. So Henrietta and David, who were 5 years apart, grew up together and were very close. They worked together in the tobacco fields, they went to school together, and they even shared a room together. So it was really no surprise to any of the family members when, at the age of 14, Henrietta had David's child. After the birth of their second child, they decided to get married, and got married on April 10th, 1941. October of that year, they decided to move to Baltimore, Maryland, so David could work on a steel mill to make a little more money and maybe have a chance at a better life. So Henrietta took her 2 kids at the time up to Baltimore. They moved into a house that David paid for with money he borrowed from his cousin, and they lived there happily for several years. David, however, was not necessarily faithful to their marriage. So by the time Henrietta had her 5th child, she knew something wasn't quite right. She had told her cousins that it felt like there was a knot growing in her womb. She went to the doctor, and knowing some of her medical history, the doctor tested her for syphilis, and when it came back negative, he sent her to the only hospital in the area that would service black people, which was Johns Hopkins. They drove the 20 miles to Johns Hopkins to the gynecology center, where the doctors there found a tumor in her cervix exactly where she told them it was going to be. In January of 1951, she was diagnosed with malignant cervical cancer, and she began intensive radiation therapy shortly after. In 1951, they didn't really know much about radiation therapy, so their form of treatment was to take tubes of radium, the stuff that killed Marie Curie and gave a whole bunch of people cancer because they were handling it. They would take tubes of this stuff and actually sew it up right next to whatever tumor they were trying to kill. So she ended up having 2 tubes of radium sewn into her body for several days, which not only gave her terrible side effects, but in the end ended up not working. The tumor metastasized, and she died in October of that year from complications with the cancer. She was buried in an unmarked grave on her family's plantation, supposedly near her mother, which was the only actual grave that had a marker on the family plantation. So none of this seems really special. None of it seems really important. It's a woman who lived in the 50s, didn't really contribute much, or so you would think. But what I didn't tell you is that part of Henrietta Lacks lives on. It's technically immortal. And it had a huge impact on the lives of everyone in our class and a lot of people throughout the world. What they didn't tell her, and I didn't tell you, is that when the doctors at Johns Hopkins Research Hospital began treatment, they actually took a dime-sized piece of her tumor out for research purposes. Dr. George Guy was working on trying to find a way to replicate cells and keep them living for as long as possible. And he was able to use her cancer cells in a way that had never been done before. Normally, cultured cells die within a few days, but for some reason, Henrietta's cancer cells lived on, and not only did they live, but they thrived. They would replicate and double in size every 48 hours. So you would start with a dime-sized portion, and in 48 hours, you'd have a quarter-sized portion, and you could divide those up. These cells were called HeLa cells, H-E-L-A, for Henrietta Lacks, and they were mass-produced when they found out that these cells would live forever. They were distributed amongst the scientific community, mostly for medical research purposes, and her cells were the first human cells to ever be cloned. They were also a key component in developing the polio vaccine, which has helped to nearly eradicate the disease from our planet. And since they first cultured it, scientists have grown over 20 tons of her cells and now have 11,000 patents for her cells. All of this is significant because Henrietta Lacks had absolutely no idea they had ever taken a sample of her cells. It was common practice in the 50s, no consent was needed. A lot of tissues that are taken today, they keep, they don't necessarily throw them away. So your cells could be out there being used for something. Her family didn't even find out about the use of her cells until researchers called to ask for their DNA to see how it compared to the mutated cancer cells. All this time, and with all this medical technology that has been developed by her cells, the family couldn't even afford health insurance. In 2013, German scientists actually published her entire individual DNA sequence. And the Lacks family sued the researchers as infringement of privacy rights. With the help of author and family friend Rebecca Skloot, the family has now reached an agreement with the National Institute of Health regarding the use of her cells in research and publication. So not everyone can just grab her cells and use them, and they certainly can't publish her history, her medical history, her DNA sequence, or the family's, which they do have some samples of. If you'd like more information about Henrietta Lacks, I highly suggest reading this book. It's called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's a fantastic book about her life, the research that it went into. It follows her, the doctors that were trying to make all of these medical discoveries, and eventually goes into a lot of the ethics about taking her cells, whether consent should have been used, and whether there was any race or gender issues involved with this. So thank you for listening.